Good morning and welcome to this overview and introduction to the biblical book of Numbers. Let's begin by reading through some of the passages at the beginning of this book where we notice an emphasis on a sense of order and planning and well laid out approach to the journey from Mount Sinai through the desert towards the promised land. Notice the emphasis in chapter 1 on taking of a census, counting numbers, working out who was there and appointing people as leaders. Verse 4, one man from each tribe is there appointed to help. And then in verse 17, Moses and Aaron take these men that have been specified, call the community together, and then announce these are the number of people, this is what is happening. So clear planning and communication is seen in Genesis chapter 1, placing an emphasis on God being a God of order and goodness and perfection. And this reminds us that in our life, a sense of order and goodness and perfection brings blessing and things work out well. When I look at a bird who's sitting on a fence and see that perfection of design in the beak and the legs and the wings and the feathers, I notice again this sense of God, the author of order, the author of things being well organized, is able to teach us a great deal about the value of perfection and order and good organization in our lives so that things might go well. And the book of Numbers begins like this, with a sense of order and perfection that we see in God. In chapter 2, the arrangement of the tribal camps around the tabernacle shows again a sense of order and the centrality of a place to meet, the centrality of a place to worship, a centrality of a gathering place where the priests and leaders would be able to be present for the people to bring their sacrifices and offerings is again a sense of order that's important socially, that is important in terms of the mental and social and communal health of the people. In chapter 3, there is the appointment of the Levites as those who are able to perform the tasks of bringing the community together and leading the community in worship and providing a place where when people feel they've failed, they can come and they can bring an offering. When people want to give thanksgiving and praise, they can come and bring an offering at the tabernacle. And then there is a branch of the Levites, the Kohathites, who are also able to be present there to participate. So things are well organized. When we come to chapter 5, we see the purity guidelines reminding that laws can be given, ritual practices can be given, in which those who have failed can be restored as they come to the temple and bring a sacrifice, and they look to the priest to be able to lead them in restoration when they get into trouble. These beginning chapters of Numbers are a reminder of Deuteronomy and Leviticus that lay out the guidelines for a healthy community and a healthy life. In chapter 6, we see the Nazarites being set aside, and then in chapter 7, the tabernacle is dedicated, and again offerings are brought, and God is declared as the one who brings goodness and hope to the people. In chapter 8, the lamps are set up, reminding them of the light of God that brings truth and hope, and the Levites are set apart to lead the people and to be readily available. In chapter 9, we see the Passover and other feasts of celebration, reminding that God is wanting to pass over judgment and bring the people on the journey towards the promised land. They're reminded of laws to avoid sin and to repent from sin when they get into trouble. And then in this chapter 9, verse 15, we're reminded that God moves like a cloud that leads the people, and like a cloud of fire, whose presence brings his goodness and perfection into their midst. But God is also a God who moves on towards his future plans and promises. In chapter 10, trumpets are blown, and the Israelites leave Sinai on the journey towards the promised land. And I'm reminded of family trips where the parents hop in the front, the children hop in the back, and they set off. Everything is well planned. Everything has been placed in the suitcases. The planning for where they're going has all been done, and they're set off with great hope. And the guidelines for these planning is laid out. However, in verse 30, some are saying they all want to go back, or that they're wanting to find their own land. So already there's a sense of dissension and murmuring happening. And I'm reminded on the family trip when people begin to murmur and complain after a time. In Number chapter 11, this storytelling narrative approach begins to take over as we see that the people start to complain about the hardships, and they start to complain about the difficulties, and wrath and judgment then comes against them. Verse 4 of chapter 11. The rabble then began to crave for other food and began to wail, if only we had meat to eat. And notice when times are difficult, people begin to lift up times in the past and elsewhere and think and describe them as being wonderful and terrific. And so in verse 5, we read that we remember the fish we ate in Egypt, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, the garlic. They don't remember the slavery, but they do remember good times of the past. And I'm reminded of an alcoholic who's been free from alcohol, but he remembers, were there good times when I was drinking the alcohol? And he might be tempted to go back to the past, forgetting the destruction to his family and loss of his job and other things that were a result of the alcohol that did damage in his life. As we go on to chapter 12, we find that even Moses' closest friends and people, Miriam and Aaron, oppose him, and they say there is a better way to go. And he said, when there is a prophet amongst you, I reveal myself to them in visions. But this, my servant Moses, he's faithful. With him I speak face to face. So there's a reminder that God has raised up a servant leader, and we need to respect and value leadership. There is a place to bring concerns to leaders, but we need to be gracious and speak from a gracious, helpful heart, and not one of murmuring and complaint. And so the anger of the Lord came against Miriam and Aaron because of their murmuring and complaints and undermining of leadership, and judgment came on them. There are lessons that we can learn from this. In chapter 13, the spies are sent out to spy the land. And again, there is this planning and investigation and research. And 10 of them came back and said, yes, there is good fruit out in the land. We could be blessed if we went out there. But those who are there, the Canaanites, are strong and powerful, and we would not be able to stand. And I'm reminded of those who are starting a study session at the university, and they become fearful that while there is blessings that can flow, there are difficult times ahead. Or farming, where people start to sow and then they fear going ahead with their farming venture because there are difficult times ahead. But two of those in the midst, Caleb and Joshua, had more faith, and they could see the blessings that lay ahead, and they declared that they were more than able, and they declared that they were able to go through into the promised land. They said, we went into the land and there was milk and honey and fruitfulness. Let's go ahead towards the blessings that are there rather than pull back through fear. And so the people rebelled, and the people didn't want to go ahead, and many wanted to go back to Egypt, to a time in the past. And so too, in the journey of life, there is a scary time when we step from where we are towards the promise that God has ahead. And so I'm reminded of a crayfish as it sheds its shell, and it's going to grow into larger new shell. It's vulnerable. It doesn't know what it's like as it's going to develop its new shell. It's a scary time when a crayfish, in order to grow and become larger and to become the crayfish it's called to be, sheds its shell, and it's vulnerable without a shell for a few days while it develops a new, larger shell. And so the people were like this. They were scared of this transition time, which is sometimes called a liminal period from the frame around a door, the liminus, which people step through. It's scary to step from one room into another and you don't know what's ahead. It's scary to step from one level of living into study in a new way or into a new job. But that's what we've got to do in order to move forward. And so some of the people wanted to go back and grumbled because they didn't want to go forward into the promises that lay ahead, because the journey could be hard, because there could be opposition along the way. And so the Israelites were encouraged to bring offerings, to bring thanksgiving, to celebrate. God is a good God and he can provide. And so they're reminded in chapter 15 of Numbers of the value of these rituals, practices, and offerings. And I know today many will go to a church service or a gathering or a home group where they'll discuss and be thankful for that which is there. Many will have a quiet, private devotional time each day where they'll give thanks and they'll read a scripture or read a reading. And in this time of thankfulness, their mind is shifted from problems to hopes and to the sense of strength in God and Jesus and the Holy Spirit that will carry them through. And we're reminded in this chapter 15 too, that there are times when we can have a sense of sin and doing wrong, but we shouldn't hide. We should come and confess that to God, whether it be in our private devotional time or whether in the gathering at church or home group. There can be a time where people privately, or they may be more open and discuss and say, there have been these failures and sins that have come in and I want to be free. I'm reminded of Alcoholics Anonymous, where they're encouraged to confess and to move forward and be thankful that they've got support around them and that there is a hope-filled future ahead for them. And then we come to the time when Korah comes and Korah brings troubles, and reminded that there can be troubles that can occur on the journey and people can oppose that which God is doing. It's a challenge to journey towards a better life, but there is hope ahead. In chapter 17, the budding of Aaron's staff too reminds us of the life that God is placing within his people and the way in which it can bud and grow. In chapter 18, priests and Levites, leaders, are provided to help lead this journey towards the promised land, and water is provided so that there can be washing and rituals. And this reminds us of the value of rituals in our own life and in our community that can lead us forwards. As the people cried out for water, then Moses heard from God that he was to speak to a rock and water would flow from it. But by this time, Moses, a leader, was tired. By this time, Moses, a leader, was developing a certain anger towards those in the community that were complaining. And instead of speaking to the rock, Moses rose his staff and struck the rock twice. This reminds us that instead of taking our troubles to God and being restful in leadership, leaders can take burdens on board and express anger, and that can get them into a lot of trouble and make things much worse. And so God's spoke to Moses and said that he too would not be able to enter the promised land, but future generations and the next generation would be able to enter. And so too in our life journey, there can be times when we reflect on how hard it is for us to reach the goal that we're moving towards, but how for our children and future generations, we press forward, we develop new hope, and education and society learn that there is a hope that we press towards. And these passages in the Bible and in Numbers encourage that vision of future hope and the planning and preparing of the present generation to support the future generation in moving towards this future hope. In chapter 21, we have a lot of this wrestling over the questions of falling back into sin, but looking to God and his provision, drawn together in the illustration of snakes come, bite, people die, but Moses is instructed to make a bronze snake and put it on a pole, and if people look to that, they will live. It's a reminder of where our eyes are fixed on looking back and looking to the troubles like the snakes, or looking to God's provision, such as the bronze snake placed on a pole, which doctors often have as a medical symbol today. And doctors and medical people can take the poison from the snake and make an antivenin. Sometimes there's a small difference between that which is sin, which can do damage, like morphine of the drug addict, and that which has been turned into a cure, which can do good, like the morphine in the hospitals that brings a cure. And so here the bronze snake represents looking to God's provision, which is remarkably different to the snake that has bitten them and does such danger. But many people might still look back to that dangerous snake in fear and even go back to it and get bitten rather than looking to God's provision. We're reminded there in chapter 21 of John chapter 3, where Jesus says to Nicodemus, Jesus is lifted up like that snake. Some see Jesus as a rebel or doing damage, but God has sent him as the one who brings hope and a future. And so those who look to Jesus are able to know the healing, future, saving power of God to bring them into the promised land. In chapter 22, we now move into the latter chapters that speak of the promised hope to come. While the Israelites are struggling down in the valley, up on the mountain, Balak and Balaam are giving a command to a prophet to speak curses upon the people. And Balak the king summons Balaam and says, you're to prophesy judgment. And in our own life, there can be those who want to say negative things about us and what is happening, but God is able to turn blessing at these times. And so while the prophet sought to speak judgment, the only thing he could say was blessing. And so the prophet Balaam pronounced that God was going to bless the people and give them a great hope and a future. So Balaam said, how can I curse those whom God has not cursed and denounce those whom the Lord has not denounced? I see a people who live apart, who will be large in number like the dust of Jacob. And so we see this message of promise and hope, and in our own lives, it's good to be encouraged by a message of promise and hope. The prophet Balaam says, no misfortune is seen in Jacob, no misery observed. The Lord, their God, is with them. The shout of the king amongst them. God brought them up out of Egypt, and they have the strength of an ox. There is no evil divination or evil omens. But now the people rise like a lioness and they go forward. And so this too can be a message of encouragement to us, even though others may be called to speak negative things. And so, like valleys, they spread out. There will be a great king. God brought them out and he takes them on. May they be blessed, though those who curse them will be cursed. So these chapters remind us that God on the mountains has a message of encouragement despite his people sometimes wanting to turn back. There is a danger that Moab can seduce the people, and there is a danger that others can lead them astray. Chapter 26 now takes a second census. Chapter 26 returns this sense of order, this sense of good planning, this sense that God is going to lead future generations into the promised land. And knowing this, the state of the flocks and the sheep, knowing how things are and planning for the future is part of this good order. In chapter 27, Joshua will be the one who succeeds Moses and leads them into the promised land, because he was the man of faith who among the spies saw the promises that lay ahead. They will bring offerings and follow the rituals that have been laid out, including the Sabbath offerings, daily offerings, monthly offerings, the Passover, the Festival of Weeks, and the other offerings that they're called to offer. They will blow the trumpets and announce the journey towards the promises ahead. They will celebrate the Day of Atonement, where they leave sin behind and know that God has provided a way in which they can be made holy and perfect to be in relationship with God and moving towards that better world, the promised land that lies ahead. They will meet in the Festival of Tabernacles and camp in tents overnight as they remember the journey towards the promised land, the better land that lays ahead. They're pilgrims on the way rather than people who settle and look back to the past. In chapter 30, they take a vow and make a commitment to go forward, and they are also reminded of the dangers and benefits of vows as they go forward. They take a stand against those who oppose them and look to God for strength to go forward, and they prepare to cross the river and enter into the promised land as the future generations go forward. There are stages in the journey towards the promised land, but we don't stay in the past. We move on towards future stages, scary as they are, because God is leading on into a better world and into a better land that lies ahead. We see an excellent outline of this journey in the Bible Project in the video that you can find by typing in Bible Project and going to the video on each of the books of the Bible, including the book of Numbers. And if we go to the Bible Project video on the book of Numbers, we see a description here in visual form of the journey from the Sinai desert, where God on Mount Sinai gives the covenant and shows the laws. There is a danger that the people could turn from the covenant and build a golden altar, but God is there also beyond judgment to restore and bring them forth towards the promised land. He provides the tabernacle and priests where the people can go to and repent and give offerings of thanks and offerings asking for forgiveness as they journey on, led by the priests and other leaders towards the promised land. Numbers chapter 1 to 10 has this positive dimension of preparing to travel. Numbers 13 to 19 describes the wilderness and the struggles of the journey in narrative storytelling form. Yes, Numbers chapter 1 to 10 describes the well-ordered numbering and census that prepares the way to go forward, and the well-laid out, well-ordered structure of the tribes around the tabernacle, like a church that has well-ordered structures and furniture, well-ordered programs, things are done on time. The Levites, the priests, all of these tribes are prepared because things are well laid out, just as God himself is a God of perfection and order who prepares a good place for all things. There are laws to follow and rituals to follow that help prepare the people for the journey as they head forward. But the people can often get into trouble and complain and murder, and judgment can come against them as they destroy the peace between one another, and they can miss out on the good things of God. Miriam and Aaron, those who are close, can oppose Moses, and there can be judgment can come against the people individually, and the community can be destroyed. Yes, spies can go out and spy out the land and bring back a sense of future hope to come at the end of the study or the end of the project, but there can be a sense of fear that the future and the opposition can be too great. Caleb and Joshua, however, were two who had a vision of the better things to come, and it was their faith that carried the next generation through to the promised land. There are those who want to go back, like the alcoholic, back to the alcohol, and there are those who murmur, but Moses prays and looks forward to the promised hope that is to come, and he reminds us of this positive vision of hope that lies ahead. We can lose a great deal, and a whole generation can die through complaint and looking backwards. But there is a future generation that can go forward into the promised land, and they can know the promises and hope that God has for future generations ahead. And this reminds us that we've got to move forward if we want to enter into the future hopes that are ahead. Yes, there'll be opposition. Even those amongst us can take a stand, which will bring difficulty and opposition as we go. People will continue to complain, like in Leviticus 20, and Moses, a leader, can lose his temper and act out of his own inner strength, and that can bring damage on the leader, just as it brought damage on the people. That sense of hope is needed if people are to go forward, and it's dangerous if we let our self-will and anger come in. We can do damage to ourselves and to the people and miss out on the promises of God. The bronze snake, as a central story in chapter 21, reminds us that those who leave themselves open to the dangers of the snake and look to that or go back to that in fear or in trouble, but those who look to the bronze snake on the staff or stand are able to know the hope and positive future that is ahead. It's a strange symbol, but it reminds us that God is both a God who brings judgment, but God who is a source of life. Let's look with hope towards the source of life rather than focusing on the negative and the judgment. Balaam the prophet, speaking blessings rather than curses, reminds us that in the heavens and on the mountaintops, God has blessing for his people rather than curses. And we can know that blessing and hope if we lift our eyes, if we gather in worship, if we have rituals and routines that remind us that God has a better hope to come. Let's not go back to the negatives or be led astray. Let's know the blessing of God. The book of Numbers does remind us of the goodness of God, reminds us of the rebellion that can often occur in the journey as people look backwards, but it also reminds us that we can turn from rebellion and judgment to future hope and trust in the mercy and goodness of God to lead us into the better world and hope in the future. Let's be like those who had hope like Joshua and Caleb, rather than like those who murmured and turned back and missed out. Throughout the Bible, God sends prophets, God sends poets, God sends apostles, God sends leaders who remind of the danger of rebellion, but also the goodness of God in faithfulness and hope. In Isaiah 63, Jeremiah 7, Ezekiel 20, Psalm 78, 95, 106, 1 Corinthians 10, Hebrews 4 and 5, we're reminded how God sends prophets, poets, apostles, leaders to warn against the dangers of turning away and unfaithfulness, and the blessing that comes when people have faithfulness and are faith-filled as they look to God. Chapters 26 to 36 remind that God seeks to provide order and guidance, wisdom, laws, rituals that'll help the new generations to move towards the promised land, to have victory over the enemies, and to settle in to the promised hope-filled future that God has for them. There is much that we can learn from the book of Numbers. We can learn about the blessing of a sense of order and an ordered life based on an understanding of the order, structure, organization, well-developed leadership, planning, wisdom that we find in God, in the book of Genesis chapter 1, in God's planning and preparing, and we see here at the beginning of the book of Numbers. David Klein's, in his book, The Themes of the Pentateuch, writes about how in Numbers we're reminded of God's promise that's outworked through a well-ordered, well-structured community with organization and leadership. Timothy Ashley, in his commentary on the book of Numbers, reminds us that these elements of orderly governance and good management and management of resources bring blessings. Balfour King and Valente, in their discussion of the modern census, look back to historical traditions that take a census, that know what is going on, and the Bible has contributed to that. John Calvin, in his commentary on the book of Numbers, reflects on order and providence and goodness in God and the blessing it can bring to us. And John Wesley, in his development of the Methodist Church, provides a way of understanding order and its application in small groups and in other gatherings. So we see the notion of data gathering. We see the notion of a well-ordered life that brings structure and stability. We see the sense of authority and responsibility and an openness to hear true complaints, but to handle them in a wise way and to bring them in a careful, kind way to the leaders rather than spread them in gossip and in murmuring. We find that the sense of order is central to the beginning and conclusion of the book of Numbers, but there is also warnings against murmuring and complaining that can do damage. And we're reminded of how different this is to bringing genuine review and complaint, to bring a genuine observation about concerns in a loving, caring way, rather than bringing murmuring and complaint about what is happening. And we see in the desire to return to Egypt, a danger that people often, for social and psychological reasons, feel more comfortable looking back to the familiarity of the past rather than the new that is uncertain, that is ahead and may require facing some challenges and some hardship, but it's worth facing in order to reach the promises ahead. Psychologically, there's a human tendency tendency to resist change in favor of familiarity of the past. And so the alcoholic may want to return to alcohol, even though it can be destructive, and they can miss out on the blessings of being freed from that and moving in the better life ahead. And so as individuals and communities, we're reminded of the importance of moving on through a greater sense of knowledge, understanding, order, and well-developed structure into the better world and better life that lays ahead for us, but also for the communities and children who follow after us. There's psychological reasons people want to move back out of fear of the future and nostalgia for the past. There are sociological reasons for fear of the new identity and the new community ahead, and people wanting to turn back to the past. There's a sense in which rituals become just blind habits instead of leading us to look to the future. There's a philosophical tension between the security of the past and uncertainty of the freedom and new life ahead. And there are theological lessons about the dangers of returning to the damage of the past rather than moving on to the hope-filled vision and provision and promises of the future. I hope that you with me enjoy exploring the book of Numbers and the insights that it has that can be applied to our own lives to bring a greater sense of trust and hope in God, in the Bible, in His Word, and the sense of order and goodness and structure that God has in Himself and finds in Himself that He's wanting to bring in our lives. I hope that you find encouragement to trust in God and trust in the journey to the future more, because there is a better hope and a better world ahead for us and future generations to come. And I pray a blessing on your life as you journey towards that future generation to come, as you resist tendencies to turn backwards or to murmur, and you trust in God and the good hope and future that He has for you. Blessings. This is Dr. Sam Hay giving a further talk on the biblical books and the book of Numbers in particular. Thank you. Look forward to catching up next time.